Hello, and welcome to Film Analysis 101 Freedom Writers Edition. We're your hosts, Andrea, Lily, Iman, and Alaniya. And today, we're going to talk about our film analysis on the movie Freedom Writers. We'll be discussing the plot of the story and the intercultural communication aspects of this American heartfelt drama that was released in 2007 and based on the book The Freedom Writers' Diary.
We chose this movie as the film covers topics of prejudice, discrimination, and integrated culture struggles that not only was relevant back then, but also reminds us that this problematic issue is still ongoing as of this recording of this presentation. It does have a happy end, so not all is lost, but it is sad that this issue is still significant today.
So, to briefly summarize the film or breeze through the plot of it, Freedom Writers tells the story of first-time English teacher Erin Gruwell and her student of room 203 at one of the first integrated schools in the US after voluntary integration had been enforced and racial tension had increased since the Los Angeles riots 2 years prior, according to the movie's timeline. Because of this, the number of minorities skyrocketed and affected the school's academic performances. It was clear from the get-go that the groups in the school were divided by race and class. This caused feeling of resentment among them and towards each other. However, through Erin's unmethodical teaching and using journals, she forms a connection with her students and gains a better understanding of them and their struggles, to which she helps in creating a safe place and brings realization to the class that they all struggle in similar ways and should not hate each other because of race. The film then follows the growth of each student and their efforts to escape the gang-related lifestyle, pursue further education, which is first foremost in their families, and ultimately starting a movement with their publication of their stories.
Moving on to the issues that were addressed in the film, we found two issues that were heavily in sight, one being racial discrimination and the other prejudice. Alaniya will be explaining racial discrimination and Iman will be handling the latter. So the floor is yours, Alaniya.
Thanks for the introduction, Lily. On the issue of race or racial discrimination, we found that the film heavily focuses on the struggles of the minorities that are the Latinos, Asians, and the African Americans or Blacks. We saw from the film that these groups of teens lived in an almost warlike zone and were most likely the result from systematic racism that existed in the USA, where these groups of people are treated less than their white counterparts.
That's honestly very sad that it's still a thing.
Indeed it is. Now, not only they had a gang-like mindset and were constantly and actively fighting and protecting their turfs or territories, many of them were on parole, came from juvie, homeless, and poor. Appearance-wise, they put on a tough exterior so as to not look weak to other people.
Were they also thought to be like dumb?
Yeah, I'm getting to that. They were looked down by not just society, but also by the school. This is evident from the way the school treated the minorities, were put in the lower class, and were given condensed version of the books, with the excuse of them not on par with their other schoolmates. Now, while the movie narrates the stories of different students in room 203, it also brings into light the perspectives of side characters. One such character was Victoria, the only Black girl in a class of whites. The teacher singles out Victoria, asking her for the Black perspective about a book. Viewers are then given a more in-depth explanation of the discrimination amongst the Black girl when Victoria speaks up about how her attempt to apply for advanced placement in some subjects with her 4.0 GPA was met with, it would be better to be in a class with her own kind. While the movie starts off with rocky relationships between the students of room 203 along with the poor management of the school, Miss Grove was the silver lining that the students needed. With time, students put their trust in her, confiding in their past experiences with discrimination, racism, and more. At the end of the year, the students of room 203 no longer integrated into racial groups, marking territories in class. On the contrary, they had formed meaningful intercultural relationships with each other, thus resolving their conflict.
Nice. Thanks, Alaniya. Iman will now be discussing the prejudice aspect in this film.
Thank you, Andrea. So, first, as we know, discrimination comes from prejudice. So let me just clarify here that prejudice is a preconceived opinion based on prior beliefs instead of facts, whereas discrimination is the act of treating someone based on that negative belief. Now, in the film, several teachers at the school perceived our group of freedom writers in a negative light due to believing that ever since the enforced integration program, the reputation of the A-list school had now dropped. One example would be Mr. Guilford, where he says, and I quote, "This was an A-list school before they, referring at the at-risk students, came here and looked at what they turned it into. Does it make sense that kids who want an education should suffer because their high school gets turned into a reform school? Because kids who do not want to be here and shouldn't be here are forced to be here."
I really hated him in the film.
Same, but anyways, this mindset show itself again in Eva, a fierce Latina of room 203, where in a confrontation with Miss Cruel, she states how she hates white people. Now, with the systemic racism always working against these people, it is understandable why Eva would think this way as what she experienced growing up. However, as referring to our definition earlier of my segment, we stated that prejudice is a negative belief. Now, through the film, we learned that negative perception that one has towards other people is not always right. For example, with Miss Cruel's teaching students of 203, grades had improved a great deal in comparison to what Miss Campbell showed at the beginning of the movie. Miss Cruel's sincere effort in teaching them and doing everything by taking up 2 part-time jobs in order to have more funds to give them a proper and quality education resulted in many freedom writers being the first in their families to graduate high school and go to college.
Teachers in the USA, that's another story altogether.
I know, right? But anyway, Miss Cruel also shows her effort in understanding and accommodating her students' lives and put in this effort to have a closer relationship with them, helping many of the students to address issues they were facing and having a safe space to turn to. This is true as towards the end, Eva's perception that all white people are bad is disproven and made her realize that not everyone in a certain group is just all good or all bad. I'm done.
All right, that's a happy ending. Thanks, Iman. Next up, we will be discussing the theory chosen for this film review, which is the conversational constraints theory. Now, this theory was developed by Min Sun Kim and her colleagues and attempts to explain how and why certain conversational strategies differ across various cultures and the effects of these differences according to how culture influences communication. Based on their findings, there are 5 universal conversational constraints that pivot on the notion that if a culture is more collectivistic or individualistic in culture, which are clarity, minimizing imposition, consideration for the other's feelings, risking negative evaluation by the receiver, and effectiveness.
We will be explaining 2 scenes that this theory applies to in the film. That is the "You Are Not Failing" scene, which Andrea will explain, and the line game scene where we have Lily for the breakdown.
Thanks, Alaniya. All right, the "You Are Not Failing" scene is about Mrs. Gurel's confrontation with Andre regarding giving himself an F on his self-evaluation. Now, the conversation in the scene is between a teacher who is passionate in helping their student, both in school and at life, who is struggling despite said student has not been honest in their tight situation and rather not burden anyone with their problem. The conversation in the scene begins with Mrs. Gruel acknowledging Andre's feelings towards his brother's conviction and offers her condolences to him. She then asks him why he had been missing class so much, to which Andre responded that he has things to do. She then jumps into the point of clarity and confronts him on the self-evaluation and questions him on why he had given himself an F. Now we, as the audience, are able to visibly see Andre's discomfort to answer why. Mrs. Gruel then proceeds to bring us to the third point, which is minimizing imposition. We see her telling him off and standing her ground on the work that they had done together as a class. She retorts to him that the grading he gave himself and says, and I quote, "This is a bleep to you, to me, and everyone in this class. I don't want excuses. I know what you're up against. All of us are against something, so you better make up your mind because until you have the balls to look me straight in the eye and tell me this is all you deserve, I am not letting you fail. I see who you are. Do you understand me? I can see you, and you are not failing. End quote. She knows of Andre's situation from his diaries. The line "I see you" really struck and was a trigger for Andre's inability to respond accordingly, as he was dumbstruck that his teacher actually read, remembered, and cared for him, even after his recent bad behavior towards schoolwork. This overlaps that Erin to the point of risking negative evaluation by the hearer. In this case, it was just Andre. She risked being remembered as a bad figure should that conversation was not as important to hear and be discussed about. After that conversation, it seemed like Andre had a wake-up call and proof that the conversation was effective.
Thank you, Andrea. Lily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iman. So we have the next scene, which portrays the theory, is the line game scene, where Mrs. Gurrell introduces the line game to the students, whereby she asks the students to step up to the line when the question applies to them. The game itself helps to gain clarity as to what her students have endured at such a young age, and allows all to see the common ground gang violence has created. Prior to her class is where the scene actually begins. Mrs. Gurrell observed the obvious segregation between the students in the courtyard, hence her idea of the game. She commences with questions relating to their interests. I quote, "First question, how many of you have the new Snoop Dogg album?" The students have their interest piqued by this question, shown through their laughs. However, remarking comments to each other are made, such as, "Did you steal it?" This part of the scene shows that the tension between the ethnic groups are heightened, which the audience can see on their faces, filled with the looks of disgust and hatred for one another. Despite this, Mrs. Gurrell begins to ask more personal questions, which breaks down the intensified atmosphere as students become quieter as they walk up to the line. Although the students do not want to be compared to the others, there is that realization that gang violence has created commonalities. When the teacher says, "Stand on the line if you've lost a friend to gang violence," it is when the antipathetic aura becomes a mutual sadness, and it only becomes sadder as the numbers start increasing. It is seen that a big portion of the class stayed on the line because they have lost 4 more friends, and Mrs. Gurrell asked the class to take a minute to pay their respects. This part in particular shows the main common ground between all the students by making them realize that they are not so different at all and face the same problems despite their cultural backgrounds. This is the first time for the students to see this similarity, as they have never communicated with one another about their problems. Lastly, this scene is the introduction of the diaries, which Mrs. Gurrell gives them for their assignment. She no longer cares about the grammar which she wanted to teach them at the beginning of the school year, but a way for her to understand her students by allowing them to write their own stories in their own way. The audience can see that she has earned the respect of the students, or at least starting to earn it, by showing she cares and that their voices mattered. The addition of the students being given the choice to leave their diaries in the cupboard to be read also shows a newly found mutual respect and trust between them and the teacher. This is another form of how communication became important in the way they can understand each other more.
Thank you, Lily. To briefly conclude, we found this film to be interesting to watch and understand why it is a must-watch to students by intercultural communication teachers in the world, especially the US, as it addresses important issues, theories that relate back to the subject.
And with that concludes our presentation for today. Thank you for watching and listening to us. Tune in next week where we will discuss the film The Help.
Just kidding, but definitely we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Film Analysis 101. Bye.
Bye.